Welcome back to the deep dive. We've got quite a stack of sources today sent in by you, our listener.
Yeah.
And the topic, it's something that's really, really foundational now. Indigenous data sovereignty and governance.
Absolutely. And our job today really is to unpack what these terms, Indigenous data sovereignty, IDSOV, and Indigenous data governance, IDGov, actually mean.
Yeah.
We want to look at, where they came from, the history, the ethics behind them.
Yeah, and their potential, too. What can they actually do?
Yeah.
We'll look at examples, how it's being done around the world, but also the hurdles, the challenges.
And this is key. We're sticking strictly to the source material you provided. That's our guide for this whole deep dive.
Right, because in this world, everything's run on data, isn't it? So understanding who controls it, especially when it's about specific peoples, specific communities, it's just critical.
It really is. And for Indigenous peoples, as these sources make incredibly clear, controlling data about themselves, their lands, their cultures, well, it's not just a tech issue. It's tied right into self-determination, justice.
It's about reclaiming control, isn't it? Over the story, the resources, the future.
Exactly. It's a fundamental assertion of inherent rights, but in this digital age.
Okay, so let's start right there. Let's unpack the basics. The sources kick off by defining Indigenous data sovereignty, IDSOV. What is that at its core?
Okay. So IDSOV fundamentally is the inherent right. And inherent is the key word here. The inherent right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern their own data about them, their cultures, their territories, autonomously.
So it's not a right someone gives them.
No, absolutely not. The sources stress it derives intrinsically from their pre-existing rights to self-governance. It's an expression of sovereignty, just, applied to data.
And Indigenous data itself. The sources say it's way more than just spreadsheets, right?
Oh, completely, yes. It includes the quantitative stuff, demographics, health stats, environmental readings, but it's much broader. It's intangible cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, languages, stories.
Oral histories, even things embedded in the land.
Exactly. Knowledge connected to land, water, even contemporary art. It's this holistic view. Indigenous knowledge is seen as interconnected, relational, spanning generations.
Okay, got it. So IDGov is that inherent right to govern all that data. Then Indigenous data governance, IDGov. That's the next piece.
Yeah, IDGov is, you could say, the practical application. It's the actual mechanisms, the policies, the protocols, the frameworks that Indigenous peoples and nations create and use to exercise that inherent right.
How they do it.
Pretty much. It's about who have the authority, how information is collected, accessed, stored, used, the nuts and bolts of managing the data according to their sovereignty.
And the sources mention kind of two aspects to IDGov.
That's right. They talk about governance of data, so managing the data about Indigenous peoples, their lands, resources, and then data for governance, which is about how Indigenous people strategically use that data for their own decision-making, strengthening their own governance, driving their own development.
Okay, so IDSOV is the right itself, the what. IDGov is the how, the practice.
Perfectly put. IDSOV provides the mandate, the legitimacy. IDGov makes it real, makes it tangible in the day-to-day. But, and this is where the sources say it gets really interesting, the success of IDGov isn't just about Indigenous communities building their own capacity internally. It heavily, profoundly relies on external groups, governments, researchers, companies, tech firms actually recognizing and respecting that Indigenous authority.
So it demands a change from the outside, too.
A fundamental shift in power relations. A sort of ceding of control by those who've historically held it.
Wow, okay. That feels like a really crucial point right out of the gate. It's not just internal work.
Not at all. External recognition is vital.
So where did this whole movement spring from? The sources paint a pretty powerful picture looking back at history.
They really do. They frame it as a direct and necessary response to historical injustices. And they use this term data colonialism.
Data colonialism. Okay, what does that mean?
It's described as a process where powerful entities, often external, assert ownership over data produced by others, often Indigenous communities, and privatize it, usually for their own benefit, without real consent or fair sharing.
Like a new form of extraction.
Exactly. The sources call it a contemporary form of capitalist accumulation by dispossession, echoing, historical land grabs, resource theft, but now with data.
And they're saying this isn't just some academic metaphor.
No, they're very clear. They call it a new era of coloniality. It continues those historical patterns of extraction and dispossession, just operating through data flows and data control now.
And the roots go way back.
Centuries. Colonial administrations collected data censuses, land surveys, but primarily for control, for taxation, for appropriating land, exploiting resources. Data was a tool of colonial power.
The sources give some really upsetting examples of misuse, too.
Yeah, deeply disturbing ones. They cite exploitative medical research, specifically mentioning nutrition studies on Indigenous children in residential schools, involving deliberate starvation, experimental foods, data collected under horrific coercion, zero consent.
That's just
Awful. It is. They also mention the misuse of Indigenous genetic data, collected without full informed consent, then used for purposes way beyond the original agreement, leading to loss of control, sometimes even unwanted patents or commercialization.
chilling. There's another stark term the sources use: data genocide.
Yeah, that refers to the systematic erasure or deliberate omission of Indigenous data from official records, from statistics. The result, Indigenous peoples, their needs, their challenges become invisible to policymakers, to the public.
How does that actually happen, that invisibility?
Well, the sources list a few ways. Governments failing to enforce accurate reporting standards, or focusing only on single race data, which completely ignores multiracial Indigenous people, or just lumping Indigenous data into broader categories, or leaving it out entirely.
And the sources used a very recent, very impactful example of the consequences of that.
They did. The stark example of poor, incomplete, or wrongly aggregated COVID-19 data for American Indian and Alaska Native communities during the pandemic. That lack of good granular data directly hampered effective public health responses. It cost lives.
A devastating, real-world illustration of data genocide.
Absolutely. Shows the tangible, harmful impact of data invisibility.
And it wasn't just about collection or omission, right? The sources mentioned imposing external systems, too.
Yes, described as epistemic violence, basically devaluing Indigenous ways of knowing, their classification systems, their understanding of the world, by forcing dominant, usually Western, frameworks onto their knowledge. It's an attack on the knowledge systems themselves.
And they even connect this digital stuff to, like, physical harm.
Yeah, that's an important point they make. We focus on digital privacy, but the whole digital economy rests on physical infrastructure. And the resource extraction need for that, they mentioned cobalt mining for electronics, disproportionately impacts marginalized communities, often Indigenous communities globally. It just continues those historical cycles of exploitation, but linked to our tech now.
Okay, so that's the really difficult history, the context.
Yeah.
But the movement rose up against this. What were some key moments the sources point to?
Well, they highlight Canada in 1996 as a really pivotal moment. The Assembly of First Nations mandated the First Nations Regional Health Survey. That was a critical Indigenous-led initiative.
And that led to OCAP.
Directly. It led to the creation of the First Nations Information Governance Center, FNIGC, and the development of those OCP principles we'll get into.
And on the international stage.
The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, from 2007, that's seen as foundational, affirming the collective rights that underpin data sovereignty. And more recently, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, GIDEA, formed in 2019.
Bringing different groups together.
Yeah, GIDEA connects regional networks like Mayam Nyarwangara in Australia, Tamana Raronga in Aotearoa in New Zealand, and the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, USIDSN.
So digging deeper.
Yeah.
What's the fundamental driver here? It feels like it's not just about fixing past wrongs, but about maybe different ways of seeing the world.
That's exactly it. The sources really emphasize this core driver, the fundamental clash between Indigenous and, let's say, predominant Western ways of understanding data, knowledge, ownership. It's not just a small difference, it's a paradigm difference.
Can you describe the Indigenous data paradigms as the sources lay them out?
They're described as holistic, deeply relational, and carrying responsibilities. Data isn't just inert information. It's understood as connected to land, to ancestors, even to non-human relatives. The sources use this incredibly powerful phrase.
Which one?
Data live, breathe, and are our relatives. That really reframes it, doesn't it? Knowledge is often seen as collective, held by the community, carrying communal duties for its care and use. So governance is guided by collective benefit, community protocols, and the strong sense of intergenerational responsibility.
Data live, breathe, and are our relatives. Wow. That definitely makes you stop and think.
It really does. It shifts it from something purely technical to something living, sacred even.
And the contrast, the predominant Western paradigm described.
That tends to view data more as discrete units, quantifiable, objective facts. There's a very strong emphasis on individual or maybe corporate proprietary ownership, often driven by economic goals or scientific advancement. Think of the whole open data movement that's big in many Western contexts. The default is often universal access.
And those very different viewpoints create real problems, don't they?
Huge challenges. Applying Western approaches without adapting them just doesn't respect indigenous holistic views. It can easily just perpetuate old colonial patterns, Western legal systems, often built on individual rights, not collective rights, making it really hard to legally protect communally owned knowledge or data.
Even things like research ethics boards.
Exactly. Standard institutional review boards, IRBs, are typically set up to assess risk to individuals. They often aren't equipped to properly evaluate risks to collective knowledge or to understand and incorporate community-level ethics from an indigenous perspective.
This friction with the open data movement seems like a really key point of tension.
Oh, absolutely critical. You have initiatives like the FAIR principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, which emphasize broad access and reuse for maximum benefit. But IDSOV and frameworks like the CARE principles we'll discuss, they prioritize indigenous control, collective benefit, and protection first.
So it's a clash over power. Who decides?
Fundamentally, who decides how data about indigenous peoples gets used, and crucially, who benefits from that use? Unrestricted sharing, which is central to open data, can cause serious harm if indigenous knowledge is sacred or highly contextual, or if it leads to appropriation, misinterpretation, or commercial exploitation without consent.
So IDSOV isn't anti-sharing.
Not at all. The sources are clear on this. It's advocating for pro-ethical, pro-sovereign sharing. Sharing, yes, but on indigenous terms, with proper consent and ensuring benefits flow back to the communities.
That's a really important distinction. Control for ethical sharing, not just locking data away.
Precisely. It's about self-determination and how knowledge flows.
Okay, so bringing these threads together, what are the foundational pillars, the principles and frameworks guiding this whole IDSOV movement?
The sources point to several key ones. Right at the heart of it all, underpinning everything, is the principle of self-determination, specifically applied to data.
Meaning indigenous communities have the final say.
Yes. It asserts their inherent authority over all decisions concerning their data: collection, access, interpretation, use, management, everything. It's framed as an absolutely essential expression of sovereignty in this information age.
Directly linked to self-government.
Directly linked to governing themselves, educating their people, managing lands and resources. Data is a crucial tool for governance, and this principle directly challenges those historical power imbalances. It's about reclaiming narrative power.
And there are specific frameworks mentioned to help make this principle practical.
Yes, the sources prominently highlight two: OCEP and the CARE principles.
Let's take OCP first.
Okay. OCP stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. It was developed by the First Nations Information Governance Center, FNIGC, in Canada. It's described as really pioneering, a rights-based framework, very influential, especially in Canada.
Can you break down those letters? OCAP.
Sure. Ownership. Indigenous communities collectively own information about them. Control. They have the right to control all aspects of data management and research involving them. Access. They must have access to data about themselves, no matter where it's held. And possession. They have the right to physically possess their data or ensure an indigenous steward controls it. And it's worth noting, OCIP is actually a registered trademark of FNIGC.
Okay, and the CARE principles.
Yeah.
Developed more recently.
Yes, by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, GIDA. CARE stands for Collective Benefit, Authority to Control, Responsibility, and Ethics. These are framed as high-level, globally relevant principles, very people and purpose-oriented.
Let's quickly run through CARE too.
Right. Collective benefit. Data initiatives must tangibly benefit Indigenous peoples and support their self-determination and well-being. Authority to control. Indigenous authority over their data needs to be recognized, respected, and actively empowered throughout the whole data lifecycle. Responsibility. Data users, researchers, institutions are accountable to Indigenous peoples and must work to support Indigenous goals. And ethics. Indigenous rights, worldviews, well-being, cultural values are the primary ethical concerns, assessed from an Indigenous standpoint, which might differ significantly from standard Western ethics.
And CARE was explicitly designed to work with FAIR.
Exactly. The sources say CARE was formulated to complement FAIR by adding that crucial ethical and human rights layer specifically for Indigenous data, recognizing that just being technically usable isn't enough without accountability and respect for rights.
So OCP and CARE, distinct but working towards similar goals of Indigenous control and benefit.
Yeah, they reflect both the diversity within the global movement and those shared fundamental aims. And beyond these big frameworks, the sources also talk about several essential elements that run through IDSOV practices.
Like free, prior, and informed consent. That comes up a lot.
FPIC is absolutely central, a cornerstone. Free means consent must be voluntary, no coercion. Prior means given well in advance with enough time for the community to deliberate using their own processes. Informed means clear, accessible information about the project purpose, methods, risks,
And it's
benefits.
about shifting power, right? Beyond just ticking a box.
Totally. It moves beyond token consultation towards genuine power sharing and respect for Indigenous decision-making authority.
What other elements did the sources highlight as key?
Cultural integrity. This means ensuring data is understood and used in a way that respects its original context, its cultural meaning, its significance according to Indigenous values and ways of knowing. It actively counters that historical decontextualization.
Makes sense. What else?
Capacity building, actively supporting communities with the skills, knowledge, resources, the infrastructure like training and governance, data analysis, IT, setting up data repositories needed to manage their own data effectively. It's about empowering communities to be active agents, not just passive subjects.
Right. And reciprocity.
Yes, building relationships based on genuine respect, trust, mutual understanding. Moving away from that old transactional model, researcher comes in, extracts data, leaves towards shared benefits, mutual learning, and actually valuing Indigenous knowledge and contributions as expertise.
Taken together, these elements, it sounds like the goal is really to decolonize the whole data lifecycle.
That's exactly the aim, embedding Indigenous values, control, and benefit at every single stage, from the initial idea right through to analysis and how the information is shared.
You mentioned care complementing fair. The sources seem to really dig into that relationship, showing how IDSOV principles bump up against things like open data.
They do. They make it really clear that FAIR principles, they focus primarily on technical usability, making data findable, accessible for reuse. But CARE, and IDSOV generally, adds that absolutely vital layer of human rights and ethics.
So uncritical use of fair could be a problem.
It definitely can, especially the accessible and reusable parts if they're applied without Indigenous consent or without recognizing collective rights and responsibilities. It can directly conflict with Indigenous control. CARE is meant to be used alongside FAIR, pushing for a more holistic, responsible data ecosystem where Indigenous sovereignty is respected.
So again, not anti-sharing, but pro-ethical sharing.
Pro-ethical and pro-sovereign sharing, sharing on Indigenous terms.
Okay, so let's get to the impact. What does gaining control over data actually do for Indigenous peoples? What's the real transformative potential here? And why should, you listening care about this?
The sources lay out some really profound potential impacts. First, and this feels maybe the most fundamental, is empowerment, agency, and reclaiming narratives.
Taking back the story.
Exactly. IDSOV gives Indigenous peoples the tools and the authority to control their own stories, define their own identities, and actively challenge those external narratives, which are often deficit-based, inaccurate, shaped by outsiders. This fosters community understanding, participation.
Yeah.
It's a form of resistance against colonial erasure and vital for cultural revitalization, even psychological healing.
Speaking their truth with their own data.
That's a great way to put it. Second, strengthening self-governance and nation rebuilding. I mean, data is indispensable for effective modern governance, right?
For making informed decisions.
Absolutely. For making policies, managing lands and resources sustainably, planning and delivering services like health, education. IDGov ensures that data collection, analysis, use. It all directly supports Indigenous priorities and strengthens their own governance structures. It helps Indigenous nations move from being dependent on external data to having data sovereignty.
Empowering local decisions.
Yes, and it allows them to engage with external government, state, federal, from a position of much greater strength, information parity, moving towards genuine nation-to-nation partnerships.
Data as a direct tool for asserting those inherent rights.
Precisely. Third big area. Preserving cultural heritage, languages, and knowledge. IDSOV is just essential for sustaining and protecting data related to cultures, knowledge systems, languages, stories, traditional practices. It safeguards heritage from being misused or appropriated.
The sources mention specific tools for this.
Yeah, platforms like Mukurtu. It's designed specifically for communities to manage their cultural data according to their own protocols. And they really highlight language revitalization as critical. Language carries culture, entire ways of knowing.
Yeah.
IDSOV initiatives like digital archives or even AI language tools can be transformative.
Like that Tehiku Media example in New Zealand.
Exactly, using AI for language preservation and regeneration, a powerful fusion of technology and tradition.
Okay. And the fourth area.
Enhancing well-being. Directly. Implementing IDSOV leads to more effective, more culturally appropriate services, health, education, social services. When communities control the data, the policies and programs designed from it actually reflect their specific needs and cultural contexts, not external assumptions.
Better data, better decisions.
Better data, interpreted by Indigenous experts who understand the local context, leads to better decisions that impact health outcomes, educational achievement, climate resilience, you name it. This can really help address those persistent disparities, contribute to initiatives like Closing the Gap.
These impacts are huge. It really moves from theory to tangible improvements in people's lives and community futures.
Yeah, it shows IDSOV isn't some abstract academic concept. It's about justice, self-determination, and fundamentally improving the well-being of Indigenous peoples.
And this isn't just theoretical, right? The sources give solid examples of IDGov in action globally.
That's right. And the examples really show the diversity of approaches. Things are adapted to unique histories, legal contexts. So in Canada, you see the ongoing impact of FNIGC and OCAMPE, especially that foundational First Nations regional health survey.
With challenges, too.
Yes, they mention challenges like getting data back to communities, citing a Nunatsiavut study, and specific regional approaches are emerging, like the Inuit NISR policy framework, co-developed, and the Inuit Nunangat policy. The Metis Nation is also developing its own distinct data governance principles.
What about the U.S.?
There, the U.S. DSN acts as a key network, but it's really tribal nations actively implementing their own IDGov, establishing tribal IRBs to oversee research, conducting their own censuses. The sources mention the Pueblo of Laguna developing its own software for that. Yeah. Entering into co-governance agreements with state or federal agencies, spearheading initiatives like the Native Biodata Consortium. Specific examples include the Swinomish Tribe's Climate Initiative data sharing agreements or the Navajo Nation Human Research Review Board mandating data turnover to the nation. The emphasis is very strongly on data as a tool for nation rebuilding.
And elsewhere. Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Australia has the Mayam Nari Wingara Collective working on principles. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, Tema Moronga is very active, and their work is often grounded in the specific treaty context there, Te Tiriti o Waitangi. They have things like the Mana Right Agreement for co-governance between Maori and the Crown, and they're really pushing technological innovation like that Tehiku Media AI for language revitalization we mentioned.
And so these examples show sort of shared goals, but different local flavors.
Exactly. The commitment to control, benefit, self-determination is consistent. But how it's implemented varies based on governance structures, relationships with the state, different histories.
What about technology's role in all this? You mentioned its duality, historically harmful, now maybe a tool for sovereignty.
Yeah, tech is definitely a double-edged sword here. Historically, it enabled harmful data collection, surveillance. But now, Indigenous communities are increasingly leveraging technology to assert and maintain their sovereignty. AI is a perfect example.
Risks and opportunities.
Big time. Real risks of bias being baked in, misrepresentation, surveillance if it's not Indigenous-led, but also huge opportunities like language revitalization, Tehuku Media, the Canadian Indigenous Languages Technology Project using AI to analyze and regenerate language.
And things like data storage, security.
Yeah, technologies like strong encryption, maybe decentralized storage systems. These can help communities maintain control and security, especially if they don't own big data centers. And specialized platforms are emerging as vital tools.
Like Mukurtu.
Mukurtu, yes, for cultural archives built around community protocols.
Right.
And local contexts with their TKBC labels, traditional knowledge, and biocultural labels, which actually embed Indigenous governance requirements directly into digital data systems. Very clever.
The sources also mentioned this broader idea, Indigenous digital sovereignty.
Right. That pushes beyond just the data itself to include control over the underlying digital infrastructure, the networks, the servers, the platforms. Owning or controlling the means of digital transmission and storage is seen as part of nation building, true sovereignty in the 21st century.
And Indigenous leadership is key there.
Absolutely paramount in developing, managing, governing this tech.
How do the wider policy and legal landscapes fit in?
Well, internationally, UNDRIP provides that foundational rights framework. Nationally, it's messy, complex. Canada has things like the tri-agency policy requiring co-developed data management plans for federally funded research involving Indigenous communities. Aotearoa has agreements like Mana Right for co-governance. In the U.S., existing laws like NHPRA or the Self-Determination Act are relevant, but not specifically designed for IDSOV.
But the sources really stress that the most important laws are often internal, right? Tribal laws.
Absolutely critical. Tribal laws and policies are direct expressions of inherent jurisdiction. Things like tribal research codes, data sharing agreements passed by tribal councils, community-specific data standards. These are the frontline legal mechanisms for exercising data sovereignty.
And external laws, state, national, can sometimes get in the way.
They definitely can. Existing privacy laws, Freedom of Information Acts mandating open access, even intellectual property laws. They just weren't designed with collective Indigenous rights or knowledge systems in mind. They can sometimes inadvertently expose sensitive data or fail to recognize communal ownership.
So it requires some tricky navigation.
Very sophisticated legal navigation, yeah. And strong advocacy for reform within those external legal systems.
Okay, so achieving full IDSOV.
Yeah.
Clearly not straightforward. What are the major hurdles, the challenges the sources point out?
Yeah, many barriers are systemic, rooted in that history we talked about, big legislative gaps where national laws just don't recognize or protect collective data rights, or even actively conflict with Indigenous protocols.
Lack of recognition.
A persistent lack of consistent recognition by external entities, governments, researchers, corporations. This leads to jurisdictional confusion, resistance to acknowledging Indigenous authority over their data, and crucially, resources.
Funding.
Chronic underfunding for basic infrastructure, for capacity building programs, for establishing and sustaining Indigenous data governance bodies. It just creates a deeply uneven playing field.
The sources also mentioned a data deficit, which sounds odd, given how much data about Indigenous peoples exists.
It's a real paradox. There's often tons of data collected about Indigenous peoples, usually by outsiders, but a real scarcity of high-quality, relevant data that's controlled by or for them, data they can actually use for their own governance and well-being.
And the sources had a term for the problematic data.
Yeah, 5D data. Data that focuses on deficits. Differences, disparities, dysfunction, disadvantage, despair. This paints a really skewed picture, leads to harmful stereotypes, misinformed policy.
And that connects back to the misclassification issues. Data genocide.
Directly. Things like racial misclassification and official stats, only using single race categories, lumping diverse groups together. It all contributes to this deficit, this invisibility or misrepresentation. The COVID-19 data problems are a tragic contemporary example. And sadly, this deficit narrative often serves to justify continued external control.
What about capacity within Indigenous communities, infrastructure needs?
Another huge challenge identified, often a lack of trained Indigenous personnel, data scientists, data stewards, IT folks who can manage secure systems, significant data literacy needs across communities to effectively use and interpret data, and major infrastructure gaps, unreliable internet, lack of secure data centers, insufficient tools, especially in remote areas.
And the sources link that underfunding directly to history.
Yes, they stress it's a direct consequence of historical marginalization. So addressing these gaps isn't just about tech support, it's a matter of justice.
And those conceptual divides we talked about earlier between Indigenous and Western views.
They create practical roadblocks every day. Western research ethics frameworks, like IRBs, are often based on individual harm-benefit analysis. They're just not equipped to handle collective knowledge, cultural protocols, community ethics properly.
Lack of researcher training.
Widespread lack of training for external researchers in Indigenous methodologies, cultural safety, ethical engagement like FPIC. This just perpetuates those extractive practices, reinforces mistrust. Bridging this divide requires fundamentally deconstructing power in research, consciously ceding control, and recognizing Indigenous ethics and governance as paramount.
Okay, so facing all these systemic challenges, how do Indigenous peoples and their allies move forward? What strategies, what solutions do the sources outline?
Well, the sources describe a multi-pronged approach to essentially decolonize data practices. A big part is actively centering Indigenous paradigms, replacing external norms with Indigenous values, ways of knowing.
Community-driven processes.
Absolutely. Implementing processes where research and data initiatives are co-developed, co-led by Indigenous communities from the start. It also means actively challenging those biased narratives, focusing on strengths-based data, using inclusive practices like recognizing multiracial Indigenous identities.
And ethical practices are key.
Foundational. Rooted in justice, equity, valuing Indigenous knowledge, minimizing data collection where possible, ensuring reciprocity, and embedding care throughout the data lifecycle. And a critical piece of this is training and supporting more Indigenous data professionals.
What about building that crucial capacity and infrastructure?
That's a core strategy. It needs sustained investment in building sustainable capacity training in data literacy, governance, tech skills, developing Indigenous-led infrastructure, secure data repositories, networks that communities actually control, and actively cultivating an Indigenous data workforce through education, mentorship, specific programs.
And these need to be Indigenous-led.
Absolutely. The sources emphasize they must be Indigenous-led and culturally grounded to be truly effective and empowering, not just another imposed system.
What about pushing for changes in policy and law?
Advocacy is vital. Using international frameworks like UNDIP to push nationally, actively working to reform existing state and national laws, privacy, open access, intellectual property, so they explicitly recognize and protect collective Indigenous data rights.
And Indigenous nations enacting their own laws.
Critically important, asserting sovereignty by enacting their own tribal laws, policies, data standards tailored to their specific contexts. This takes legal innovation, sustained advocacy, and asserting that inherent jurisdiction.
And what about changing how external institutions work? Universities, research bodies.
Transforming institutional practice is absolutely essential. It means external organizations committing to build real, trustworthy, reciprocal relationships, making ethical engagement the default, honoring protocols, doing FPIC properly, centering Indigenous voices in design and interpretation, sharing benefits fairly.
A cultural shift in academia.
Exactly. Fundamentally transforming research institutions, ethics boards, to incorporate Indigenous ethics and expertise to genuinely share power in the research process. It's a big cultural change needed.
Lastly, how does the movement grapple with the fast-changing tech landscape? Big data, AI.
The sources portray this as very much an ongoing dynamic process. Applying IDSoft principles to big data analytics, to AI development, to digital transformation is crucial. It's about navigating the risks new forms of digital colonialism, baked-in bias, while seizing the opportunities, like AI for language revitalization.
So the future involves
Empowering Indigenous youth with digital skills, adapting best practices through dialogue with knowledge holders, ensuring partnerships with tech companies are truly ethical, built on Indigenous terms from the ground up.
So IDSoft isn't like a fixed destination, but more of a living framework, adapting.
Precisely. As the sources beautifully put it, the future involves weaving technology into our traditions and traditions into technology in a way that serves Indigenous rights and self-determined futures.
This has been, wow, a really insightful deep dive. The sources make it so clear that IDSoft and IDGov aren't just, technical terms. They're absolutely fundamental for Indigenous self-determination, for justice, cultural survival, and for Indigenous peoples shaping their own futures on their own terms.
Yeah, they're critical for rectifying those historical injustices, reclaiming narratives, strengthening governance, preserving irreplaceable heritage, enhancing well-being, and just ensuring ethical engagement in this data-driven world we all live in now.
And the sources really issue a strong call for action, don't they? Outlining those shared responsibilities. Indigenous nations lead the way. Governments need to recognize resource reform. Researchers, institutions have to transform their practices. Technologists need to co-design, ensure accountability.
It really demands collaboration, trust, and a fundamental rethinking of how data works, especially data about people.
And that final thought from the sources, it really sticks with you. That idea of the future involving weaving technology into our traditions and traditions into technology.
Yeah, what does that dynamic interplay truly mean? How can data, knowledge, technology either continue to perpetuate those old power imbalances or be genuinely harnessed to serve Indigenous rights, self-determined futures, and the well-being of communities?
It's a powerful question to leave you, our listener, thinking about.